Thank you for being here this morning. It really is a beautiful spring day out there. Usually when I say that, people laugh, but not this morning. So I want to just start out talking a little bit about the statistics that you saw in the subtitles of the video. United Nations in September of last year gave an updated estimate on the number of human trafficking victims around the world. And as you may have noticed in the video, the new total is 40 million people on any given day in 2016 held in some form of modern-day slavery. 40 million people, that's a lot. That's larger than the population of California, larger than the population of Canada, larger than the population of Australia and New Zealand combined. If you took everybody who called Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois home, call it their home, in those 4 states, it's about equal to the population that's being held in slavery. Most of the victims are labor trafficking victims. They're forced to work in farm fields, they're forced to work in factories, fishing boats, a variety of commercial activities, including in the United States, including in Indiana. We have labor trafficking victims here. 4.8 million, roughly 4.8 million of human trafficking victims are held in the commercial sex trade. Most are women and girls. Of that 4.8 million, more than 1 million are children. My work focused primarily on child sex trafficking, primarily in the United States, but also in other countries, because it's a bigger problem in other countries than it is here. It's just important to understand that context. It happens here. It happens with frequency here. It's a real problem in our state and our communities. But we also just have to have an understanding of the context as we address this problem. We need to address the problem here in our own country, but there's a lot of work to be done overseas as well. Best estimate I've seen in terms of the numbers of children who are exploited in the sex trade in the United States comes from a 2016 U.S. Department of Justice study. That study focused on 13 to 17-year-olds, so teenagers, 13 to 17, and the estimate was between 9,000 and roughly 11,000 kids a year, 13 to 17, who are commercially exploited. That study did not look at children under the age of 13. And we know that there are at least several hundred kids, 12 and younger, who are commercially exploited every year. And it happens here in our own communities. There were 4 12-year-olds who were rescued from Indianapolis in about a 6-week span last fall. So we have 12-year-olds being sold for sex in our community with some regularity. The youngest I've seen from Indiana, that was a 2016 report, the youngest was 7 years old. And that same year, an 11-year-old was rescued in Hamilton County. So we are talking about young kids, very, very young kids at times. The average age, though, in the United States and in Indiana, the average age for exploitation is 15. And I don't think I need to emphasize this point very much with this audience, but I always try to say, you know, a 15-year-old is still a child. A 15-year-old can't drive a car legally. Obviously can't vote, can't buy alcohol, can't buy cigarettes. There are reasons why we put those protections in place for 15-year-olds. And I always want to kind of emphasize that point. I was in the red light district in Bangkok, Thailand, in October of 2016, and sat down with a woman named Annie Dieselberg. And Annie founded the Nightlight Foundation that works with sex trafficking victims in Nana Plaza. Nana Plaza is a sprawling red light district in Bangkok. Men come in from all over the world to buy sex there. And there are men and women who are trafficked from all over the world into that red light district and the areas around it. So Annie and her husband and her team have been working there for 17, 18 years now. And one of the points that she made, I think, is extremely important for us to understand as we look at human trafficking. She talked about the horrible normal. And it was a point that really shaped my thinking as I worked on the Exploited project. We hear about the 7-year-old from Indiana who's exploited, and that's horrible, horrific, and we all cringe at that. But then when I say that the average age of victim is 15, we kind of don't cringe as much, because 15's older than a 7-year-old, right? It's older than the 12-year-olds I talked about. But 15 is the horrible normal. Thousands of 15-year-olds are exploited every year in our country, and hundreds of 15-year-olds or 14 or 16-year-olds are exploited in our own state. One of the most important things to remember about the commercial sex trade is that it's commercial, it's a business. What do you need to have a successful business? You first have to have a supply, and what's the other? Demand. Exactly. My work focused primarily on the demand. I started with a question: who buys a 15-year-old for sex? And the answer is hard sometimes for people to accept. Because the answer is, it's otherwise ordinary men. Now, their behavior is not acceptable, it's not ordinary. What they're doing in that instance is monstrous. But they very well could be your next door neighbor, they could be your boss, they could be a coworker, and they come from all lines of work. They blend into the community. They go about their business. They do their job. They have families. And if you met one, if you had a friend who was a buyer, you might never know. If you met one, you would never know. But it's not a small number of guys. One of the last interviews I did for the Exploited Project was here in Indiana. I sat down with a 17-year-old survivor at a Starbucks in southern Indiana. She had been exploited 2 years before when she was 15. She was in the foster care system here in the state, coming from a very dysfunctional background in her family. There were problems in the foster home. She ran away. She ended up on the streets here in Indianapolis. She was stealing food to survive. She was trying to find a place to sleep each night. And one day she met a guy at a gas station on the east side. They struck up a conversation. And he told her that he produced music videos for a living, and he'd like her to be in one of his music videos. So she agreed to go with him. Within 2 days, she was in another city. She was in a motel. Ads were placed on Backpage, and the men started to arrive. 5 guys a day, on average, every day for a month. She got 1 day off in that month. But estimate about 150 men who showed up at that hotel room. Of the men who arrived, she said only 2 of them saw her age, and turned around and left and said, "You're too young." Good for those 2 guys to a degree, but what didn't they do? They didn't call the police, they didn't call DCS. They went about their business, probably because they were afraid somebody would find out what they were doing. And they left a 15-year-old in a motel room to continue to be exploited. She told me that while it was happening, she really didn't believe that she deserved anything better. she finally was able to contact former foster mom. The foster mom contacted the police. Police arrived at the motel, and she was rescued and entered treatment. And it was a long, long journey of recovery for her. Had lots of peaks and valleys. And I tell that story because it's really common. 15, on the streets, was in foster care, exploited by 5 men a day, day after day after day. And then once she was rescued, the path to recovery was extremely hard, and it took a long time. The kids who are exploited in these ways, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, have suffered severe trauma before they're ever exploited by a sex trafficker, by a pimp. In fact, pimps and sex traffickers count on that. What pimps do is look for something, some vulnerability that they can exploit. So the 15-year-old was obviously very vulnerable. She was on the streets by herself. She was coming out of an abusive background. She needed a place to sleep, something to eat. And it's pretty easy for somebody who wants to exploit a child to fill those needs. My work focuses on demand side because as sad as it is, and as important as it is to work on the prevention side, we are not going to run out of vulnerable children. We're also not going to run out of people who are willing to exploit them for profit. Now, don't misunderstand me. We've got to focus on prevention. We need to do a better job of protecting kids in our foster care system because they're highly vulnerable for exploitation. We need to go hard after the people who profit from it, meaning pimps and traffickers. Those are all important steps. But until we attack the demand side in a really serious and focused way, we're not going to make progress on this issue. And in fact, I think there's pretty good evidence that we're losing ground. The demand is growing. It's certainly growing internationally, and I think there's some evidence that it's growing in our own country. And that's despite 20 years of very dedicated efforts to attack this problem. It's not unlike the drug trade. I worked in South Florida in the 80s and 90s, and the DEA would have press conferences where they would talk about seizing incredible amounts of cocaine. And if you just listen to those press conferences, you would get the sense that, hey, we're winning the drug war. But we all know that wasn't the reality. Americans had an almost insatiable demand for illicit drugs. And there was a ready supply of illicit drugs. And there were traffickers who were willing to take the risk to make an extraordinary amount of money. As long as there's a demand, it's very, very difficult, despite incredible efforts and despite good intentions, it's very, very difficult to stop an illegal activity. So I think we've got to start focusing on the demand side in a bigger way. What I saw in case after case after case of horrible exploitation of children is that the buyers were not held accountable. So the 15-year-old from Indiana I talked about, 150 men paid to sexually abuse her, and I think we have to think of it in that way. This is commercialized sexual abuse. Washington State actually changed the language of its trafficking laws to reflect that. If a person is arrested for trying to buy a child, a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old in Washington State, they're not charged with human trafficking violations. They're charged with commercialized sexual exploitation of a child. It gets to the heart of what we're really talking about. And I think that's very, very important for multiple reasons. One is that the buyers, for the most part, aren't seeking to purchase a child for sex. They just don't care. The person that they're purchasing, a boy or a girl, might be 19 or 20 or 18 or 21 or 14 or 15 or 16. They don't want to know. I had a buyer in Seattle tell me that the whole business is built on lies, and he's absolutely correct. The whole business is built on lies. So pimps aren't stupid. They're not going to advertise a 15-year-old as a 15-year-old. The ads, one of the trends I noticed that I thought was interesting, I'm not going to say humorous because it's such a dark topic, but interesting. How many supposed 19-year-olds are working their way through college in the sex trade? Remember, the whole business is built on lies. You can put anything in an ad. That 19-year-old working her way through college may be a 14-year-old runaway. She may be 25. But why 19? And what sex buyers told me that when I asked that question is that 19 is the sweet spot. If she's advertised as 18, you kind of wonder, am I being set up? But 19 is still a teenager. We live in a culture that we know that sex sells, but we live in a culture where young sex sells. Look at our advertising, look at our entertainment. The messaging there is very, very consistent. And so the guy who talked about 19 being the sweet spot was in his mid-40s. He'd worked for Microsoft for 10 years as a computer engineer before he was arrested. He also told me when I talked to him that he was buying sex at least once a week before he was arrested. And his story, again, is pretty common. There's a tremendous demand. I shadowed in late January, I shadowed a couple of undercover officers up in Muncie, Indiana. They placed an ad on a couple of websites, not Backpage, two other websites, in which one of the officers posed as an 18-year-old who would meet you in a hotel room along with her 15-year-old friend. It's what in the trade is known as a 2-for-1 special. By the time I met with those officers for a briefing before we went to the hotel, more than 100 men had responded to the ad. The officer had more than 400 text messages from the men, and they were extremely explicit messages of guys who thought they were texting an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old. On a Tuesday afternoon in Muncie, Indiana, at a decent hotel, a hotel any of us would feel comfortable staying at, 5 guys showed up at the door, and they were otherwise ordinary men for the most part. One was a Ball State student. One worked for another university in Ohio. One, as he was sitting in a room with handcuffs, told us that he had 2 daughters of his own at home, including a 15-year-old. These were just ordinary guys on a Tuesday afternoon in Muncie. At the end of the night, I talked to the undercover officer who, he has a young family, and it's very, very difficult work. I mean, he's getting horrific, explicit messages from men on his phone for a full day. He was exhausted. But he said his only regret was that the next day he needed to go back to his day job, which is to fight the drug trade. And he knew those guys would still be out there. The demand doesn't go away. So how do we change that? Well, I think part of it is we all have a responsibility to help change the conversation, change attitudes in our culture. And I didn't arrive at that conclusion very easily. One of the first interviews I did, a background interview, was with Ascent 121. And Megan Jessup, who works with more than 100 girls from Indiana every year who have been trafficked. Megan said, "Tim, this is a cultural issue." And I really wasn't quite ready to hear that and accept it, to be honest. It took months of reporting before I came to the conclusion that this is a cultural issue. And it was extremely valuable for me in reporting to see other cultures around the world where the sex trade is very much accepted, where there's just not as much of an emphasis on cracking down on this exploitation as there is in the United States, and where the rates are much higher than what they are here. And I started to ask, well, why is that? And it's because it's kind of accepted in some countries. But before we start to feel too good about that as Americans, we have to look at what's happening in our own communities. And as much as we say we're outraged by this, and we are, we still don't really treat the buyers for what they're really doing. We make excuses. If you're 40 years old and you show up at a hotel room to buy an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old, and you've exchanged multiple text messages with a police officer describing exactly what you want to do, explain to me why we should go easy on that guy. But we do. And as much as we're outraged by this, I'm not sure we treat it all that seriously. Until we start to go after the buyers in a consistent way, we're not going to change this. And until we do that, we're going to continue to see 10,000 kids, more than 10,000 kids a year, who endure horrible exploitation. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. I am saying we should not accept the unacceptable, and it's unacceptable that more than 10,000 kids a year are exploited in these ways in our communities. And it's not happening just in Los Angeles or New York or Chicago. It's happening in Muncie, Indiana, or name the community. It's happening here, and it's happening to kids who are already extremely vulnerable. And the path to recovery for these kids is very, very difficult. They often come out of the trade with numerous physical problems. exhaustion, malnutrition, addiction. Just go down a long list. But the body has the ability to heal much, much faster than our mind and spirit. Finding healing is very possible, and there's great work being done in restoration work. But it's hard work, and it will take a long time. One of the things that was really difficult for me to accept in the Exploited Project was that even after these kids are rescued, they have to go through years and years and years of healing and recovery. I mean, that's just almost always the case. And the people who paid to exploit them went home. Even in cases where a 12-year-old was rescued, the men who paid to exploit that 12-year-old went home. And more likely than not, they were going to Backpage or another site to look for a new victim because they weren't suffering any serious consequences. And I'm not pretending that going after those men would be easy, but all of this activity takes place online, almost all of it. Almost all of it involves text messaging. There are records. It can be done. We choose not to do it. So you're sitting there saying, Tim, we're really depressed now. I get that. And it is a hard, very, very hard topic, as Leanne said. But I want to leave you with this before I take questions. I finished the Exploited Project feeling hopeful, despite everything I've seen. I mean, I met 2 6-year-old trafficking victims, one in Tijuana, Mexico, one in Pattaya, Thailand. I interviewed more than 60 survivors who shared horrific stories of exploitation. So how can I stand here today and honestly say I feel hopeful? And the reason why I feel hopeful is because I also met people all over the world, including here in Indianapolis, who are pouring their lives out to prevent and rescue and restore. And they're doing tremendous work. The conversation is changing. The good news is, on the state level and on the federal level, we've made really good progress in improving our laws and raising awareness that this is happening. If you're a sex trafficker, and especially if you're exploiting children in our state or somewhere in our country, and you get caught and you're convicted, you're going to go to prison for a long time. There's a 10-year mandatory federal minimum for a human trafficking conviction. We've made good progress. Yeah, I'll get to that. I'll get to that in just a minute. I'll take questions and talk about Backpage. But so we've made good progress in going after traffickers. We still have a lot of work to do. It's still pretty much a high reward, low risk criminal enterprise. We've made good progress, I think, in identifying and rescuing victims. Still a lot of work to do there, but we've made progress. We've made very little progress in attacking the demand side. And I think, again, until we do that, I don't think we're going to see a significant reduction. But with all that said, I feel hopeful because the conversation has changed, and we've made progress in those areas of going after pimps and traffickers and providing better services for victims. So I don't want to stand here and give you a false picture that good things aren't happening. They are. There are a number of organizations represented here today who are doing very, very good work on the local level. The fact that you're here today on a beautiful spring day is encouraging. But we still have a lot of work to do, and I think we still have a lot of work to do on the demand side. So thank you. I want to take some questions now, and just raise your hand and fire away.
You guys hear about the white rhino that went extinct just recently?
Mm-hmm.
He was killed. The last white rhino was killed because of the horn it was sought after for its the benefit of the natural Viagra, and the idea. And forgive me for, but the idea that men and this whole need for a hard-on is killing an animal that's been here for how many, is a very sick thing. Because we need to actually throw out an entire species for a hard-on. And I had to get my heart around that and understand something about that. And I read, or I listened to, watched, a lady say that, and I'll try to quote this, when a culture more or less is dead, spiritually, sex is always the distractor. When there's no communication or awareness of anything, and they're distracted, well, a person won't see what they're doing at all.
Right.
They are too busy just looking for a hard-on, just looking for the next, orgasm, the next, experience, and not see anything. I mean, it's addiction.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that there's a certain percentage of buyers who don't care. They simply don't care about the damage that they're doing. And it's very, very difficult to reach them. Now, thankfully, that's a relatively small percentage of sex buyers, and it's a much smaller percentage of the overall male population. Those are the guys that we're going to have to go after in two ways. One is, if you persist in this behavior, you're going to face serious jail time. But I think more likely, because we can't lock up tens of thousands of men, we just can't. We have to go after them on a financial level. You're going to really pay for this. And right now they don't. But if we have severe fines for soliciting a child, then I think we might start to change that behavior, because the pain gets enough for them, they begin to change. Thankfully, that's a relatively small percent. Some of the research I've seen is that somewhere between 15 and 20% of American males will buy sex at some point in their lifetime. So 15 to 20% of the overall male population in the United States. It's much higher in some other countries. It gets back to cultural attitudes. But 15 to 20% in the United States, we're talking about around 120 million adult males in the United States. So when you look at 15 or 20%, that's a big demographic if you're running a business. Of that 15 to 20%, most of the buyers are 1 to 3 times in a lifetime. And then there's a smaller percent, about 15 to 20% of buyers who are maybe once a year, maybe 3 times a year. And then the estimates I've seen is about 5% are the hardcore buying sex once or more often in a week. And that population is extremely hard to reach. So we have to be smart in how we go after the demand side and understand that there are different segments of the market, and we have to approach them in different ways. And why that's important is that education and awareness can help in reaching the 1 to 3 times in a lifetime buyer. Changing our cultural messaging is really important. How many times have we seen movies or TV shows that make very light of the fact that a guy is buying a prostitute? It's a joke. It's accepted. It's common. Oh, it's a bachelor party in Las Vegas. And the messaging is that it's somehow okay and expected. The exploitation side of it is skimmed over and ignored. And so I think we need to start to reach men to help them understand that if you're purchasing sex, there's a very good chance that you're buying somebody who's being exploited against his or her will. There was research done in San Diego County 2 years ago, another Department of Justice funded study that looked at women who had been arrested for the first time in prostitution. And slightly more than half, about 51%, had been or were victims of sex trafficking when they were arrested. So roughly 1 in 2 of first-time arrestees for prostitution fit into the sex trafficking category. And I don't think most people understand that. Now, by federal and state law, anybody 17 or younger who's working in the sex trade is a human trafficking victim. There is no, I want to do this, this is my choice if you're 15 years old. But we start to lose understanding and empathy and sympathy for a person who's 25, 23, 27. And we start to tell ourselves, well, that's her choice. And choice is a really complex idea. If you were sexually abused when you were 10 years old, and you ended up in foster care when you were 12, and then you were sold off a back page when you were 15, how much of a choice did you really have when you were 18, 19, 20 about how you were going to live your one life? We like to think that adults have true choices, but our experiences shape our choices. And there are a lot of people walking around out there who, like that 15-year-old who said, I don't really deserve anything better, they believe that about themselves. And so when a pimp makes all sorts of promises and uses all sorts of manipulation on the 22-year-old, choice is not really at play there. There are a lot of parallels between the sex trade and sex trafficking and domestic violence. And one of the things we know about domestic violence, it's really difficult for victims to leave the people who are abusing them. It's not easy to walk away. I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question. You've mentioned Backpage. So if we know it's a trafficking business internet site, why can't it be shut down?
Well, it recently was. And that is a good news and not so good news. I wouldn't say bad news, but a good news and not so good news situation. So Congress passed, after a lot of work and a lot of effort, Congress passed legislation recently that enabled federal authorities to go after Backpage and other sites where there is commercial exploitation being advertised. Shortly after Congress passed the legislation and the President signed the bill, the FBI shut the website down. And the owners were arrested and are facing very serious charges. I am not at all defending Backpage, and certainly not defending the people who operated it. They were profiting. They were making millions and millions of dollars off the exploitation of other human beings. I think it's a win that Backpage was shut down. But here's the not so good news side of that. Backpage is one website. And it's really, really easy in 2018 to create another website. We were already starting to see the migration of ads before the shutdown. I mentioned the raid in the sting operation in Muncie. Those ads were not placed on Backpage. They were placed on 2 other websites. I went to one of those websites a couple of days after Backpage ceased operations. And the operators had a message at the top of that website that said, please excuse us for the slow loading times. We're seeing an unusual spike in activity, and we are in the process of upgrading our servers. What does that tell us? Demand is still out there. It's still enormous. And as good as it is to get a Backpage off the market, there's plenty of other people who are willing to take the dollars and profit from it as long as there's this tremendous demand. I think we're out of time. I will be back at 1 o'clock for a panel discussion, and please feel free to ask questions then. Thank you so much.